Hey, what's up guys? Today, I'll show you an action sci-fi film, Venom, Part 1. Spoiler ahead, watch out and take care. Drake is the CEO of the bioengineering corporation called Life Foundation, and his company is sending astronauts to collect specimens of an alien race called symbiote from a space comet. During the trip back to Earth, the symbiote's leader, Riot, attacks the crew within the spacecraft, causing them to crash in the eastern part of Malaysia. Drake and his lead scientist, Dr. Skirth, rushed to San Francisco headquarters to hear an update about his fallen spacecraft in Malaysia. Fortunately, the astronauts managed to retrieve 4 specimens, but Riot is missing. In Malaysia, an emergency medical team rushes to the crash site to search for any survivors. Luckily, one astronaut survives and is immediately brought into an ambulance. It turns out Riot has bonded with the survivor, and then he transfers to the Malaysian paramedic during the trip to the hospital. The ambulance flips sideways, allowing Riot to escape and plan his journey to San Francisco. Meanwhile, Eddie, an investigative reporter running a TV show, is preparing his work with his fiancée, attorney Anne, who currently works as a defense attorney for Life Foundation against a filed lawsuit. Afterward, Eddie goes to the network building to attend a meeting. The TV producer tells Eddie to interview Drake about his space program, but Eddie refuses because he finds Drake's personality suspicious. However, the producer reminds Eddie that he needs to do this job, otherwise he'll lose it. At night, Eddie and Anne enjoy a long romantic dinner before heading home for a 2-minute smelly workout. Eddie wakes up in the middle of the night and snoops into Anne's business laptop, where he reads a classified case about Life Foundation. He learns the corporation is under investigation because of dying volunteers involved in their lab experiments. The next day, during the interview with Drake, Eddie confronts him about the deaths of the volunteers in his experiments. Drake deflects the accusations of Eddie and ends the interview altogether. Eddie's desire to expose the truth costs him everything in his life. He loses his career, apartment, and relationship with Anne, simply because he chose to sneak behind Anne and accuse Drake without evidence. Drake finally obtains the specimens in his lab, but elsewhere, Riot transfers from the paramedic to possess an elderly woman. For 6 months, Dr. Skirth and Drake collaborate to achieve the symbiosis between animals and symbiotes. It shows that the symbiotes require compatibility with their respiratory hosts in order to merge and survive in an oxygen-rich environment. Otherwise, they'd only reject the host and die. After numerous tests, the first symbiote finally bonds with a rabbit, since they're compatible. This small achievement pushes Drake to conduct human trials immediately, even without proper tests from more animals. Drake believes if humans and symbiotes can achieve symbiosis, both races can survive on Earth and in space. Drake decides to rush the experiments onto the next level, despite Dr. Skirth being against it. Meanwhile, the unemployed Eddie becomes a jobless drunkard. He befriends a homeless and shop owner, Mrs. Chen, who treats him like her own child. Eddie is shopping at the store when a thug enters to rob Mrs. Chen's income. Sadly, Eddie can only watch because the thug carries a gun. When the thug finally leaves, Eddie pays for his items. Afterward, he goes to his worn apartment, trying to search for jobs to pay the bills, but there's none available. He also meditates as suggested by Mrs. Chen, but his loud neighbor only ruins the experience. The following day, Drake starts the human trial with a man, but it only ends poorly because the symbiote only rejects the man's body. Instantly, Drake sends another volunteer into the lab for more tests. Drake's absence of empathy towards humans forces Dr. Skirth to ask for Eddie's help. She meets him at Mrs. Chen's store to confirm that all of his accusations of Drake before are true. Drake deceives poor people into joining his experiments, uses them as test subjects, and doesn't care if they die during trials. Dr. Skirth wants to expose the truth with Eddie's help, but he refuses since he doesn't care about saving people anymore, and because he lost everything in his life the last time he dealt with Drake. Eddie parts from Dr. Skirth and decides to visit Anne because he misses her. He offers to rekindle their hormoneship, but Anne is already committed to Dr. Dan, a surgeon in a hospital. Hormone devastated, Eddie walks away, leaving Anne outside her apartment. Since Eddie has nothing to lose anymore, he decides to help Dr. Skirth in exposing the truth. That night, Dr. Skirth sneaks Eddie into the lab while briefing him about the definite space program. It's revealed that Drake had sent astronauts into space, discovering millions of symbiotes living in a comet. The astronauts brought back 4 specimens of that alien race, and Drake experimented on them, forcing symbiosis to occur between a human and a symbiote. Drake firmly believes the union between the two races is the key to survival in space. Their conversation abruptly ends because a watchman happens to do his rounds. Dr. Skirth distracts the watchman, whereas Eddie enters the lab to investigate the ongoing anomalies inside. Eddie takes pictures of imprisoned volunteers in their cells to serve as evidence of Drake's deadly experiments. While investigating, Eddie finds his homeless friend in one of the cells, so he breaks her out of the cell, but the homeless strangely attacks him. It turns out a symbiote inhabiting her body named Venom wants to transfer to Eddie. Eddie unknowingly merges with Venom because he's rather occupied in stopping his homeless friend from hurting him. When Venom transfers completely to Eddie, the homeless dies. Unfortunately, Eddie triggers the building's alarm system when he freed the homeless earlier. He runs away from the security team and inadvertently fights them using his new profound strength and speed. He then climbs a tall tree upon reaching the forest to evade the rounding security team below him. He arrives at his apartment in the morning and calls Dr. Skirth to update that he's safe and assure her that he's going to expose the evidence to abolish Drake's human trials. However, something extraordinary happens to Eddie. He suddenly becomes hungry and thirsty. When he finally regains control of himself, a strange creature appears for the first time before him. While Eddie brushes his teeth, his eyes morph into solid white, and Venom finally calls Eddie's name. Eddie stumbles backward and collapses after hitting his head on the tub. He shortly regains his consciousness and decides to ask for Ann and Dan's help to expose Drake's schemes. However, Dan and Ann notice Eddie is looking ill and sweaty, especially when he decides to eat a live lobster in front of everybody. Fortunately, Dan introduces himself as Eddie's doctor to the restaurant's hostess to prevent them from reporting Eddie to the authorities. Afterward, Dan injects a sedative into Eddie so he can bring him to the hospital for a proper health examination. Eddie wakes up and finds himself inside an MRI. He experiences convulsions during the scan, as the MRI whirs a high frequency of sound. Dan quickly disables the MRI and escorts Eddie outside the hallway, advising him to take a rest while waiting for the result. Meanwhile, Drake quickly deploys his security chief to hunt down the culprit who breached the lab and stole his missing symbiote. Soon after, the security chief deduces Dr. Skirth as the accomplice in helping the culprit steal the symbiote. Drake's anger fades upon seeing a male volunteer successfully merges with a symbiote, but it doesn't last long because the volunteer dies in the end after the symbiote consumed all of his organs. Moreover, they learned from the test that symbiote's weakness is the high frequency of sound. Just then, the security chief escorts Dr. Skirth to Drake. She then reveals the possible culprit might be Eddie. Drake recognizes the name and decides to kill Dr. Skirth by feeding her to his symbiote. Meanwhile, Eddie undergoes drastic changes as he carries Venom in his body. While he tries to satisfy Venom's starvation, Ann and Dan call to tell him that there's a parasite in his body. After the phone call, Eddie stops his loud neighbor from making electric guitar sounds again by letting Venom scare the loud shit out of him. The neighbor agrees to be quiet, and Eddie returns peacefully to his apartment. However, this peace soon ends when Venom warns Eddie not to open the door. But Eddie opens the door, allowing the security team to surround him completely. The security chief orders Eddie to follow them, but Venom doesn't want to follow, so he puts himself into action. Venom envelops Eddie's limbs and attacks everyone who assaults him. Venom shows interest in biting their heads off, but Eddie stops him. Afterward, Eddie goes to an alley, where he finally sees his reflection is replaced with Venom's face. The security chief survives Venom's attack and returns to the van to send a live feed to Drake. Once again, the security team with their drones and choppers pursue Eddie, who's riding on a Tesla bike. During the chase, Drake witnesses the beautiful symbiosis between Eddie and Venom, who display a compatible relationship as Venom defends Eddie from aerial attacks and injuries. However, the fast and furious chase ends when the security chief rams his van onto Eddie. Eddie drops on the street with a broken leg and wounds. The security chief is about to extract Venom from Eddie when suddenly all his physical wounds and fractures heal under a minute. They then watch Venom envelop himself around Eddie like bulletproof body armor. Venom shows off its all figure with black smooth, oily skin texture, but possibly smelly. Venom strangles the security chief in the air, then licks his face with his pointy tongue, not to tongue massage him, but threatens to eat all of his organs, including his smelly one. Suddenly, a security shoots Venom in the back, but Venom only deflects the bullets and eats his greasy head. Afterward, Venom flees from the busy street and travels to an isolated place to properly introduce himself to Eddie. Venom reveals his name and then explains he chose Eddie to be his host because they're compatible in both DNA and hormones. He also refers to themselves as "we" since they're now merged into one body. Next, Venom explains he needs Drake's rocket to reunite with his race in space. Then he ends his introduction with a warning to Eddie not to mess with him if he wants to live. Meanwhile, Drake returns to the laboratory, where he discovers the symbiote that killed Dr. Skirth earlier was left alone to die because the scientists failed to return it to its container. He then summons the security chief to retrieve the symbiote in Eddie's body because it's the only one left. Afterward, Drake finds a strange little girl inside the lab. When he welcomes her, the little girl speaks with a different voice. Just then, Riot emerges from the little girl and appears before Drake. After jumping from one body to another for days, Riot finally bonds with a human whom he's compatible with. Meanwhile, Anne keenly searches for Eddie after learning about Eddie's abnormal results from the MRI examination. She can't contact Eddie and visits his apartment. However, his apartment building is surrounded by police due to the dead bodies found on the perimeter. Once again, she returns to the road and calls Eddie again. This time, Eddie finally picks up the phone. Eddie's on his way to the network building to deliver the evidence to the TV producer's office. He tells Anne it's dangerous to be around him, so he warns her to back away, but Annie insists on seeing him because she's worried. Eddie ends the call without disclosing his location. He then enters the building, but the guard stops him. Just then, Venom offers himself to bring Eddie to the specific floor. He envelops Eddie, then leaps his way onto the top. From the top of the building, Venom shows off his handsome figure and comments that he pities such a beautiful world because it's about to get destroyed by his race. Suddenly, a police chopper generates a shrieking sound behind Venom to enfeeble him. Venom quivers and quickly seeps back into Eddie's body to hide. But without him, Eddie loses his grip and falls off the building. While falling, Venom re-emerges in time by sticking his hand on the wall to stop their drop. Afterward, they break into the TV producer's office, and Eddie places his phone, containing the evidence of Drake's experiments, with a message to remind the TV producer to do the right thing. When they reach the ground floor, government authorities have them surrounded. Eddie warns them to retreat, but they don't listen. Therefore, Eddie allows Venom to take over and annihilate all of them with his massive build and strength. When the fight ends, Venom wants to eat one of the officers, but Anne suddenly screams from afar. Upon witnessing Venom revert back to Eddie, Eddie quickly explains that he needs help, and so Anne brings him to the hospital. On their way to the hospital, Venom speaks to Anne through Eddie, who only repeats his words. When Anne offers to use the MRI again, Eddie explains its sound is one of Venom's weaknesses, besides fire. Just then, Venom senses Eddie's boggling mind and emotion, so he convinces him to apologize for his mistake before it's too late. Eddie appreciates the suggestion and proceeds to apologize to Anne for ruining their hormone ship before. Later at the hospital, Dr. Dan explains there's a parasite inside Eddie that's slowly killing him. He insists on getting it out, but Venom says to Eddie that he can heal all of his ailments as long as they're together. However, Dan's persistence to cure Eddie provokes Venom to attack Dan. Anne remembers Venom fears the MRI, so she activates the machine to evict Venom out of Eddie's body. Venom escapes from Eddie's body, and Anne traps him inside the lab. Eddie points his finger at Venom, completely hurt by the realization that Venom is killing him after all their wee thing packed. Eddie then exits the room, leaving them alone. While Dan and Anne are talking, they realize Venom has escaped through the vents. Venom then bonds with a messy dog to follow Eddie's hormone trace, but he stops after witnessing the security team abducting Eddie. Since Venom can't do anything inside a shitty dog, he returns to Anne, who's smart enough to discern he's inside the dog. Meanwhile, Eddie meets Drake, who demands to reclaim his symbiote. But when Eddie answers he doesn't know, Riot finally reveals himself to repeat the question. Unfortunately, Eddie doesn't really know Venom's location, and so Drake disposes of him like garbage and orders his men to kill him. Afterward, Riot and Drake discuss retrieving more symbiotes in space, and Drake willingly offers his finishing rocket to collect them all, so they can rule the world once and for all. Meanwhile, Venom temporarily uses Anne's body to save Eddie from nearly dying. Venom attacks the security team and eats the security chief's greasy head, but not his smelly part. Afterward, Venom returns to Eddie and pushes Anne and Eddie to have a fast, fantastic, but smelly workout. Venom and Eddie reunite once again, and Venom tells Eddie it's dangerous for Anne to join the battle because the symbiote inside Drake is the strong leader of their race. Nevertheless, Venom decides to remain on Earth as its protector against invaders, simply because he likes Eddie, who has many similarities to him, such as being losers in their own worlds. Meanwhile, Drake arrives at HQ to rush the rocket launch despite his employees' warnings. When an employee tries to cancel the launch, Riot emerges before them and attacks everyone in the room. The rocket is about to launch in 5 minutes, and Riot rushes to the space dock, but Venom suddenly appears before him. When Riot invites Venom to join, Venom answers he won't let him destroy Earth by summoning more of their race to the planet. Riot now perceives Venom as a traitor because Venom chooses to deviate from his race. Riot attacks him, which results in a heavy fight between the leader and the loser. Riot brings out his arsenal to beat Venom, and Venom tries his best to endure. They fight until they reach the dock near the rocket, and Venom displays declining strength. Suddenly, Riot snatches Venom off Eddie and nearly eats him, but Eddie quickly runs into Venom to merge once again. The two hosts and symbiotes cinematically battle until they merge into one. Since Riot is stronger, he dominates around Venom. Riot then climbs onto the rocket, but Anne wittily activates the loudspeaker to weaken and separate the symbiotes from their hosts. Only 1 minute left before the rocket launches, and Eddie thinks Drake is dead after kicking him off the platform. Suddenly, Eddie's chest bleeds as Riot pierces him. Eddie drops to the floor, whereas Riot boards the rocket with confidence that he's going to rule Earth. However, Venom is still alive, who crawls back to Eddie and heals and revives him altogether. The rocket shortly soars to the sky, but Venom tears down the walls to make it explode. Soon, the rocket bursts into flames, killing Riot and Drake in the pilot's seat. Meanwhile, Venom morphs into a parachute to soften Eddie's drop on the water, but it also means it's dying from the fiery blast, because one of its weaknesses is fire. The movie ends with Anne and Eddie chatting peacefully outside the apartment. Eddie announces he's a journalist again, but only as a writer this time. Moreover, Annie is unaware that Venom survives the incident and is alive and well inside Eddie. Afterward, Eddie reminds Venom he can only eat bad and baldy guys, but never good or hairy guys. Then they go to Mrs. Chen's store to buy chocolates for Venom, when suddenly the thug returns to steal money from Mrs. Chen. This time, Eddie turns from being a bystander to an anti-hero because of Venom. Venom emerges from Eddie and taunts the thug not to mess with people again. Otherwise, he's going to devour his smelly ass. When the thug asks for his name, Venom and Eddie's faces appear side by side and speak in unison, "We are Venom." But then, Venom abruptly changes his mind and eats the thug's whole body in front of Mrs. Chen. Eddie reverts to his human self and leaves the store like nothing unusual happened. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.